Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you to Neda and UNICEF for the invitation. Social change. Obviously, that's what everyone's here for. I wouldn't say everyone wants social change. Some people are doing quite well as it is now, but I'm going to be the radical of the group. As a fan, denied that it will be the radical, so I'm going to fill in the shoes he chose not to. Short anecdote first. In the mid-1990s, I was starting out in development work. This old Danish evaluator who had been doing evaluation work since the 1970s. He said that NGO work is like a marketplace. You do your work well, you provide the services well, they're going to prosper. So, this guy, for 3 decades doing NGO work from Denmark, I was quite happy with that. He kept that as a framework. As a young development worker, it was appealing. It's nice. NGO types like these ethics, values, norms of good behavior. It was nice to think that in the NGO world, you do your work well, you're rewarded for good behavior. Unfortunately, I also took a few courses in economics in undergraduates. And in the real world, there are no perfect markets. In the real world, there are no perfect NGOs or perfect development circles. So it was appealing, but as time went on, the analogy totally fell apart. We have imperfect information, literally NGOs that fabricate outputs. We have NGOs well-meaning, trying to come up with information good for donors, but they couldn't articulate it. At the same time, we also had donors looking at the wrong thing. So, a mishmash into a horror story, I think that Dr. I just mentioned. NGO work is difficult, we all know that. Quick question, who among this bunch here are from CSOs? It's just me. I can say whatever I want, you'll have to believe me. Many of you have admitted to be from CSOs, we know that's impossible to do. 25 minutes, there's no way to talk about thousands, maybe tens of thousands of different CSOs just in the Philippines, doing all sorts of work at different levels in different ways. So after half a second of thinking about it, I threw that idea out the window. But having said that, I do think that there are two aspects about monitoring evaluation from the CSO perspective that are important to take up. First slide, please. There's a lot of theorizing, debate, discussions, and very rich literature on what civil society is. But cutting through all that, bottom line is civil society is, I think, it's usually perceived as mediating between the state and the market, representing the people, unbound by political problems, domination of economic powers and political powers. So I'm going to keep that sort of rough framework in mind right now in this discussion about civil societies and monitoring evaluation. 2 points I want to raise with the flag right here. I'm not going to bombard you with lots of slides and lots of text, but to forgive me, I'm feeling a bit ill, so I wrote down some notes as far as I could. First, CSOs are neither state nor private profit-seeking market players, and so, by that nature, can function to check both. So in this sense, the development role is to empower citizens, contribute to a larger democratization of society, even to the extent of seeking, I think this is where the benefits of CSOs come from, broader transformations in economic, social, political power. For instance, abusive, irresponsible, negligent governments are made accountable, pushed to fulfill their public duties, or even changed, as in the case of what happened in the Philippines a couple of times in the past. With respect to evaluation and accountability, the topic at hand, CSO's function, we think, is to give the perspective of the poor and marginalized, one, in assessments of national policy, and then also in how businesses could conduct themselves. Because we all know there are tendencies to abuse by governments and tendencies to abuse by the private sector, profit seekers. Second point, I think more common, at least in the last 2 discussions right now, referring to NGOs in particular, CSOs provide services to poor communities and marginalized sectors. So in this sense, the development role is not at holding government accountable or holding business accountable. In that sense, they're much more localized. They're there to fill in service gaps. And perhaps, because they have bright ideas, that's be proven, improve how governments and the private sector might give their services to the people if they don't do it well enough. So with respect to evaluation and accountability, it's a much more constrained notion. NGOs' responsibility is to have internal schemes to ensure the effectiveness of their development interventions. Next slide, please. So two broad areas of where CSOs can speak, I think, of content evaluation. Larger social democratization, their role in those tripartite arrangement of state, market, and civil society, and a bit more localized, but also much more concrete for many, service delivery. I'm going to take these two notions in turn. Next slide, please. On one hand, there are a lot of encouraging developments in terms of CSOs. Again, I'm not going to ramble on about so many things, but some of the hype, I think, is worth talking about. In the Philippines, we have, no doubt, growing numbers of CSOs and growing numbers of people involved directly or indirectly in CSOs. CSOs, obviously, they're usually thought of as NGOs, I think. It's my impression. But CSOs obviously don't just count NGOs. They also count those organizations, these organizations, maybe church groups, and all that. But in the development world, especially when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, CSO, a bit inaccurately, but conventionally, are thought of as NGOs. So I think that's important, very encouraging. CSOs have grown in the Philippines in terms of their number and reach. At the same time, they've grown, lots more people going to CSO work. One thing they've never let go of, no matter how many these have grown, they've all self-identified themselves as being pro-development and pro-empowerment. It's obviously quite important because governments can say that, but if governments say it all the time, big business will complain. A company can say that, obviously they're pro-development empowerment, but when their profits get affected, when bottom lines are affected, that becomes a problem. So I think one particularity of CSOs, the rhetoric at least, they can uphold it, they can talk about it without sort of cutting into their reason for being. Last, I think, particularly encouraging, the last few decades in the Philippines, especially since the 1980s, no doubt increasing CSO engagement with government. So from various levels, from the 1987 Constitution, recognizing the role of civil society, from the local government code, from lots of high-level bodies being created, and APSI having NGOs involved, countless summits being called. Anytime development is spoken of right now compared to the 1970s, CSOs are going to be there. Also, I think a fairly recent development, at least in the Philippines, the last decade and a half has seen lots of former CSO leaders actually physically coming to government and facilitating how their network of CSOs, where they come from, engaging and talking through these mechanisms created. So I think that's very important. In terms of democratization, the facts are there, developments are there. There has been a lot of encouraging development in terms of CSOs, in terms of democratization. But one thing I have to highlight there is, especially in the 1970s and 80s, and until now, a lot of, especially activist CSOs, have perceived poverty as a political thing. Not just a merely technical thing, but a political thing where to resolve it, you need political solutions. And that's one thing that CSOs have been uniquely able to do, that governments have not been able to do probably, because they are balancing competing interests, rich and poor society, and also that businesses cannot uphold rigorously, balancing workers and capitalists and management. So poverty for a lot of CSOs is a political issue with political solutions needed. The next slide I'm going to go very quickly through because it's very hard to actually explain in much detail. The three important things about CSOs the last years have been well, they're links to communities. The whole point about CSOs is supposed to be more deeper links, deeper grounding in communities and marginalized sectors and the poor. Ostensibly, CSOs are hotbeds for innovation and creativity, especially in terms of pro-people approaches, because that's where they start from, being embedded, not having these bureaucratic restrictions, not having to worry about corporate profits and bottom line, and so on and so forth. But last, I think very, especially upon the impetus of external forces, also growing professionalization and systematization of their work. CSOs, NGOs in particular, have tried the last couple of decades to be more professional and systematic in terms of systems, in terms of their policy procedures, in terms of their policies. I think in terms of service delivery, the second aspect of CSO work, the CSO's comparative advantages are still there. Next slide, please. Having said that, everything has a plus and a minus. We can also ask some questions in terms of democratization, in terms of modeling and evaluation. CSOs were meant to have that role of holding the state to account. CSOs were meant to have that role of holding businesses to account. But in this question right now, it's a little bit nagging, but hard to put a figure on. Despite this incredible growth in CSOs in the Philippines, despite the free market, despite free elections, despite the free press, despite all these seeming indicators of greater democratization in the country, including greater participation of CSOs, NGOs, and POs in governance, for some reason, we still have the persistence of underdevelopment. So again, it's not a one-to-one correspondence thing, but it does lead to a question. Why, despite 3 decades of growing CSO engagement in government, why despite this flourishing of CSOs at unprecedented degree, why is there still underdevelopment in the country? So all the discussion about inclusive growth, poverty, and all that, that should be a nagging question. Now, one worrisome trend that we in IBON and many CSOs would like to point out is, despite this flourishing of CSOs, we've also noticed that a lot of CSOs have ceased to be, have broken away from their radical roots. A lot of CSOs have been reduced to providing services. A lot of CSOs have been, for lack of a better word, contractualized. CSOs now are emerging, are operating, are expanding, are getting lots of money, not so much in the spirit of democratization, because the Philippines, it's been said, is a democracy already, but in terms of being subcontracted service delivery units. Now, we would posit actually that is where part of the problem lies. When CSOs have ceased to be fiscalizers, when CSOs have ceased to use their critical mass of voices of people to actually challenge the government to do something for income, asset, wealth reforms, we would posit that that is where a problem is emerging. So I think that's one important point we'd like to highlight. Unfortunately, I was able to attend the discussions on accountability of the government for its policies yesterday. But I think CSOs feel that, speaking for citizens, that is something that could be done, holding governments to account for the policies they have. Next slide, please. This is very familiar, I think, to a lot of people. I was actually looking forward to having at least some other NGO folks here right now, because it's not a bombshell, but it's not often said. In terms of service delivery, I don't think it was discussed yesterday or discussed earlier this morning, but this is a common complaint, common point of discussion among CSOs. Accountability has been drifting not so much towards accountability to self-declared development values of CSOs, has not even been biased towards their supposed constituents and beneficiaries. Accountability, especially as reflected in M&E systems, is to funders. So these horror stories, well, they're there. The horror stories are there. It was actually put a bit more bluntly than I was willing to put it, but when you ask monitoring evaluation for what and for who, it's done by CSOs, but unfortunately it's done for funders. And this is, I think, something that it's useful to raise, straight out with some NGOs that we support. When you come out with your monitoring evaluation, you do your nice log frame, and you spend your 2 months doing this log frame and you sort of go into the cycle of filling all the details. Was it helpful for you? I was actually heartened by the earlier comment that, well, a lot of times, no. I think unfortunately in the Philippines, again, to be candid, a lot of these M&E systems, especially even the projects, are a bit problematic. Now, that's not because CSOs don't believe in monitoring evaluation. All CSOs do monitoring evaluation. But the thing is, when most CSOs do marketing evaluation, it's not from their particular context. It's not from having limited resources, having limited staff, having to work with communities. A lot of these things, they just don't fit very well with short 3-year projects. They don't fit in well in terms of quarterly or semester reports. They don't fit in well with like 8 pages of matrices where you want quantitative indicators. Once you have a marketing evaluation system, very well meaning, I think, very useful in terms of organizing things, but if it's not organized in a way that CSOs think, then that breaks down. Then it becomes a burden. Then instead of becoming helpful, instead of helping CSO think, CSOs have actually been forced to think in a way that is useful for donors. And I think, again, to put it quite bluntly, I think there's a big problem in terms of the monitoring systems right now. When monitoring evaluation schemes, when CSO, NGO leaders, with NGO staff end up doing things not for themselves, not for the beneficiaries, not for the project, but because that's required by the funders, then that's obviously, I think, a major problem that happens. Now, I have not seen, I've not heard of any significant NGO literature in the Philippines that has explored this in more detail, but I think it's very important. If CSOs are meant to be innovative, flexible, pro-people, adaptable to communities, working with communities, having very participatory processes, I think it's very useful to ask, when an alien, cumbersome, tedious, time-consuming marketing evaluation system comes in, to what extent does actually erode those very comparative advantages that we wanted from CSOs? Again, I have not seen any study like that, but there's actually a lot of anecdotal evidence where it's actually counterproductive. And it's counterproductive, leading to very poor development performance. So I think it's also very useful, candid maybe drinking moments with CSO beneficiaries, with CSO partners. Have a good chat with them. See really how those marketing evaluations schemes are being used. Next slide, please. These are 3 things I've picked out, which I think underlie the problems why sometimes, a lot of times, marketing evaluation schemes, which are very nice, very coherent, very cohesive for donors, may not actually be helpful for individual NGOs. First is, it's quite simple, when an NGO is looking for its organizational existence in terms of its finances, that is an awful condition for creating donor dependency. When an NGO has very finite, very erratic finances, the tendency is when donor is there, when marketing evaluation of donor demands are there, there's a very strong tendency for that CSO to do what the donor wants. Not necessarily because it's for their benefit, but because it cuts to the heart of providing what the donor needs, because that is what they will ensure the financial practice is running. So in finite erratic finances, that's a very, very basic condition of most CSOs, especially small CSOs who are in the Philippines, and that's a big problem in terms of creating donor dependencies. Second, unstable staffing and unstable staffing because they can't afford to maintain staff for any length of time, and uneven capacity. Uneven capacity meaning, especially in the Philippines, a lot of NGOs don't really have these well-educated college graduates, very familiar with Western frameworks and concepts, and don't have the patience to actually churn through complicated planning and multi-evaluation systems. Now, again, to the extent that an NGO is suffering unstable staffing, staff coming in and out, there's familiarity with the program, and uneven capacity in terms of ability to really work on the complicated systems. To the extent that they have that, then these alien M&E systems become even more disruptive. And it only aggregates things if you have one NGO with 3 donors, with 3 different marketing evaluation systems. You literally would have some NGOs spending a month, 2 months, every 6 months, working on their M&E for 3 different donors. Because they can't reconcile that, then donors will not accept a unified system for the NGO. But what they need is a specific, attractive 3-year projects M&E. So, second point. Third point, more as a sector, NGOs are very small in the Philippines. I saw a recent study by Civicus, apparent average size of Philippine NGOs between 10 to 25. We also counted anywhere from 6,000 to 15,000 to 18,000 to as much as 35,000 NGOs. The NGO sector as a whole is very small, very different kinds of work, and very dispersed. Again, in a context where there's organizational survival, it creates conditions for inter-NGO competition, which aggravates this whole problem called donor dependency. So on one hand, you have individual NGOs with an inclination to give donors what they want. At the same time, you have lots of NGOs all scrambling over each other to give a few donors what they want. So again, I hope I'm not sort of being too repetitive, but the end result is when the CSO is created, when it sort of had its self-perception of what development work is, slowly, incrementally, maybe somewhat imperceptibly, there is a danger that through time, they are adjusting actually their thinking, their development to what donors are able to deliver, which we believe undermines these supposed comparative advantages. Next please. Remedies are always around. The question is, are we willing and able to take the remedies needed? Spoonfuls of sugar, as it were. We have to start with the premise. If there is a belief that NGOs and CSOs have a role as NGOs and CSOs in development, not as subcontractors of government or not as extensions of corporations, if we work on that schema of having three spheres in society, actually there are some difficult remedies that are possible. I've clustered them around three areas in terms of funding, in terms of NGO leverage, and in terms of M&E. One simple way to go around the problem of donors who also have their own requirements, obviously, their own organizational demands. One simple way of removing that sort of pressure on CSOs to adapt to donors is to break the link between donors, to lessen the influence of donors over specific CSOs. Now, obviously, in terms of funding mechanisms, that means some kind of surrender of sovereignty and control by donors. I don't know if any donor is willing to actually surrender much sovereignty or control over their funding, but again, that's why they're called difficult remedies. But if donors are willing to do that, one thing that could be done is for donors, individually or as a whole, to force funding to an independent multi-stakeholder body where CSOs are not secondary or a wholly CSO body. Again, this is an attempt to sort of put a layer to break that compulsion by donors to use their control over the money to inadvertently, a lot of times, and we understand, influence how CSOs think. A second unconventional proposal is to actually have public subsidies for NGOs. Again, it's good democratization in the spirit of ensuring some kind of stability, predictability, and independence in CSOs. In the same way that political parties are given subsidies in the Netherlands, Canada, and the UK, some kind of public subsidies for CSOs to give them that base of finance and stability might also be helpful. Core funding is also quite important. Right now, well, the norm is short-term NGO contractualization. NGOs work on 1 year, 2 year, 3 year contracts, perhaps with different donors. Sometimes the same donor, but basically it's a bit sort of short-term contract culture among NGOs. Core funding and some longer-term institutional support for NGOs could actually remedy that problem. Because as long as NGOs don't know where the money is going to be coming from next year, as long as NGOs would have to be scrambling for donors and giving donors what they want, then they would not be able to sort of themselves create these internalized modeling evaluation systems that are actually in line with the multiple accountabilities. The values CSOs have to the beneficiaries they declared or even to their donors. So that kind of stability, predictability, and independence is quite important. Obviously, all these things are premised on some kind of continuous dialogue. Right now, it's true. Most donors are very willing and have the resources and assign people to talk to CSOs on a continuous basis. But the reality is, when push comes to shove, donors tend to have more power than CSOs. Next, please. In terms of CSOs, but I think NGOs in particular, if we're talking about projects, I think it's important in the spirit of democratization in terms of maintaining the schema of state, civil society, and business. It's important for NGOs to strengthen their sources of their soft power. Soft power because they don't have the money to assert their themselves, but I think two things very important for NGOs which they have, which have been the source of their dynamism over the past decades, should be nurtured even more. The first, very important, linking up to people's organizations, organized communities, and social movements. It's a little bit of an aside. I was talking to the planner Enrique. We were wondering, and it's not good stuff coming out in terms of knowledge, in terms of wanting an evaluation. But there's no political, a lot of cases, no political will actually push that. Well, in a social sense, the political will should come from citizens, from the public, as manifested in people's organizations. I think for NGOs, a very important source of soft power. For them to actively link up to people's organizations, which would give them much more political clout relative to funders. I bracket autonomously because, again, it's also been done. Unfortunately, an NGO creates an organization as a beneficiary. When the funding comes up, when the funding runs dry, the organization collapses because it's just created for project purposes. I think it's very important in terms of building political clout. Secondly, also very important, NGOs have ostensibly a lot of new ideas, new innovations, bias towards the people. And I think going beyond, innovative methods at the project level. I think innovations in terms of holding governments to account, holding state, holding business to account, those sorts of ideas should have to be generated. And I can imagine an NGO with these kinds of links, with these kinds of steady generation of ideas proven in practice, I can imagine them having a little bit more leverage than they have without these. Secondly, needs a bit more boldness. I think facing the free rider problem. I think it is a reality. Perhaps inadvertently, but in a lot of cases, unfortunately, quite consciously, CSOs give donors what they want and what they want to hear. I think it would be helpful for NGOs to actually be much more aggressive in putting their cards on the table. These are the priorities. These are important for us. With our track record, we can give this to you. We can deliver. They may not be exactly what you want, but they're what development demands. I think that's sort of greater boldness in terms of CSOs and less adaptation to donor demands. Whether the calls for proposals or going to the website and the sort of proposals they've done in the past. I think that sort of assertiveness is actually a good antidote for CSOs to maintain their development values and to maintain their dynamism and keep playing their role in a civil society. Last point, actually very secondary, but I think worth mentioning. Right now, M&E schemes have to be taken into consideration the transactional context, the balance of power between NGOs and POs and communities. If there's a change in the relationship between funders and NGOs, upward accountability, or between NGOs and POs, obviously the monetary evaluation schemes, in terms of the framework, the technique, the approach, has to be appropriate to that sort of change relationship. And again, as a counterpoint, there would be a problem if the bias is for upward accountability of NGOs to funders. And I put very, very distantly, this is what I've actually avoided. I've personally been in NGOs since 1994, 1995, my first time I worked as an evaluator. On the side, I still do evaluation work with other NGOs. Lots of different techniques right now, going beyond the normal monitoring system. Most significant change, process tracing, with experimental studies, control groups, and all that. That's all being done. But I've added here because it's important to improve our techniques. But I think more than that, the previous two slides and the first top slide, I think actually much more important. There's a lot of cases, more than the technical aspect of it, a lot of cases it's the balance of power that is decisive in relationships. So, I think it might be next slide, please. Okay, well, anyway, concluding point, we do come from a perspective that the dynamism of civil society, the dynamism of NGOs, and their comparative advantages come from their being independent, come from having this attitude, this standpoint, this viewpoint of challenging the way things are. This is so important to let go of, and I think if it's done, CSOs will play their role in development much better, and all of us as development stakeholders will be much closer to our to change the aura.